The American presidency is the most powerful office in the world. With that power comes the potential for catastrophic mistakes. Some presidential decisions have cost thousands of lives, triggered economic collapse, or damaged America's standing for generations. These aren't just policy disagreements or partisan disputes. These are objectively disastrous choices that historians across the political spectrum recognize as failures. This is the story of America's worst presidential decisions and the men who made them. Let's start with one of the most consequential disasters in American history, James Buchanan and the road to civil war. In 1857, Buchanan became president at a moment when the nation desperately needed strong leadership. The question of slavery's expansion was tearing the country apart. Buchanan, a Northern Democrat sympathetic to Southern interests, believed he could preserve the Union through compromise and appeasement. His first major decision was to publicly endorse the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, which declared that black people couldn't be citizens and that Congress couldn't restrict slavery in the territories. Buchanan had privately lobbied Supreme Court justices to rule this way, believing it would settle the slavery question forever. Instead, it enraged the North and emboldened Southern radicals. When Kansas descended into violence over whether to enter the Union as a slave or free state, Buchanan sided with pro-slavery forces trying to impose a constitution that most Kansans opposed. This bleeding Kansas crisis demonstrated Buchanan's willingness to sacrifice democracy to appease the South. Northern Democrats abandoned him. His party fractured. Then came the ultimate failure. After Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860, Southern states began seceding. Buchanan's response was paralysis. He declared that secession was illegal, but that he had no power to stop it. He did nothing as Southern states seized federal property, arsenals, and forts. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 states had left the Union, and war was inevitable. Buchanan's weakness and indecision made the Civil War far worse than it needed to be. Historians consistently rank him as America's worst president. Moving forward to the 20th century, we encounter Warren G. Harding and the Teapot Dome scandal. Harding won the presidency in 1920, promising a return to normalcy after World War I. He was genial, handsome, and completely out of his depth. Harding himself admitted, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." Harding's biggest mistake was appointing corrupt cronies to powerful positions. His Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, orchestrated the Teapot Dome scandal, secretly leasing federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for massive bribes. When the scheme was exposed, it became the biggest scandal in American history until Watergate. Fall became the first cabinet member ever sent to prison. But Teapot Dome was just one scandal among many. Harding's Attorney General took bribes to sell pardons and government appointments. His Veterans Bureau director embezzled millions meant for disabled World War I veterans. Harding's poker-playing buddies looted the government while he looked the other way. The corruption was so extensive that Harding's scandal became synonymous with government graft. Harding died in office in 1923, possibly from a heart attack, possibly from poisoning. The circumstances remain murky. He never faced the full consequences of his appointments, but his reputation never recovered. His decision to prioritize loyalty over competence and to tolerate corruption devastated public trust in government. Now let's talk about Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, Hoover had been president for only 7 months. The crash didn't cause the depression. That resulted from deeper structural problems. But Hoover's response turned a recession into a catastrophe. Hoover believed deeply in limited government and voluntary cooperation between business and labor. When the economy collapsed, he refused to provide direct federal relief to suffering Americans. He believed that would destroy American character and create dependency. Instead, he encouraged private charity and state governments to handle relief, but they were overwhelmed. As unemployment hit 25%, as banks failed by the thousands, as families lost their homes and children went hungry, Hoover insisted recovery was just around the corner. He seemed callous and out of touch. Shantytowns where homeless families lived in cardboard boxes were called Hoovervilles. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags. Hoover's worst decision came in 1932, when he ordered the army to evict the bonus army. Thousands of World War I veterans who had marched to Washington demanding early payment of promised bonuses. General MacArthur, exceeding his orders, used tanks, tear gas, and cavalry to violently disperse veterans and their families. The optics were devastating. American soldiers attacking American veterans during the nation's worst economic crisis. Hoover lost the 1932 election in a landslide to Franklin Roosevelt. FDR's New Deal programs, direct federal relief, jobs programs, banking reforms represented everything Hoover had opposed. Whether the New Deal ended the Depression is debated, but it unquestionably helped millions of Americans Hoover had ignored. His rigid ideology in the face of unprecedented suffering remains one of history's clearest examples of failed leadership. Jumping ahead to the Cold War, we find Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, just 3 months into his presidency, Kennedy approved the CIA plan to invade Cuba with a force of Cuban exiles. The goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government 90 miles from Florida. The plan was doomed from the start. The CIA assured Kennedy that the invasion would trigger a popular uprising against Castro. This was fantasy. Castro's regime was far more secure than the CIA believed, and Cuban intelligence knew about the invasion plans. When 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17th, Castro's forces were waiting. Kennedy had reduced American air support at the last minute, fearing international backlash. Without air cover, the invaders were slaughtered or captured. Within 3 days, the operation was a complete failure. Over 100 exiles died, more than 1,100 were captured. Kennedy had to negotiate their release, eventually trading $53 million in food and medicine. The Bay of Pigs disaster emboldened Castro, strengthened his alliance with the Soviet Union, and humiliated the United States globally. It directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later, when the Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy himself called the Bay of Pigs the worst mistake of his presidency. Speaking of catastrophic foreign policy, we must discuss Lyndon B. Johnson and the escalation of the Vietnam War. Johnson inherited American involvement in Vietnam from Kennedy, but it was LBJ who transformed it into a full-scale war that would tear America apart. In August 1964, Johnson used the Gulf of Tonkin incident, alleged attacks on American ships by North Vietnamese forces, to push through Congress the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him broad war powers. The incident was exaggerated and partially fabricated, but it gave Johnson the authority to escalate without a formal declaration of war. Johnson and his advisors believed in the domino theory, that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. They also feared looking weak on communism. So Johnson began bombing North Vietnam and sending ground troops. In 1965, there were 23,000 American troops in Vietnam. By 1968, there were over 500,000. The war was unwinnable. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were fighting on their home territory with popular support in many areas. American forces won virtually every major battle, but couldn't achieve strategic victory. The war dragged on, casualties mounted, and protests exploded across America. Johnson's decision to escalate rather than negotiate or withdraw cost 58,000 American lives and perhaps 2 million Vietnamese lives. It destroyed his presidency. He declined to run for re-election in 1968. The war didn't end until 1975 with the fall of Saigon, achieving exactly what Johnson had tried to prevent. Vietnam became shorthand for arrogant, misguided American interventionism. Richard Nixon inherited the Vietnam War, but he created his own disaster, Watergate. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They were connected to Nixon's re-election campaign. The burglary itself was a third-rate operation. The real disaster was Nixon's response. Instead of immediately distancing himself from the crime, Nixon orchestrated a massive cover-up. He approved hush money payments to the burglars. He ordered the CIA to interfere with the FBI investigation. He lied repeatedly to the American people. As investigations intensified, Nixon's paranoia grew. He had secretly recorded all conversations in the Oval Office. When investigators subpoenaed the tapes, Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege. When the Supreme Court ordered him to hand them over, the tapes revealed his direct involvement in the cover-up. By August 1974, Nixon faced certain impeachment and removal from office. He resigned on August 9th, becoming the only American president ever to do so. His vice president, Gerald Ford, pardoned him a month later, a controversial decision that helped Ford lose the 1976 election. Watergate wasn't just about a burglary. Nixon had used the IRS to target political enemies, had maintained an enemies list, and had approved illegal wiretaps. His administration saw dozens of officials convicted of crimes. The scandal devastated public trust in government at a level not seen since. Nixon's decision to cover up rather than come clean transformed a scandal into a constitutional crisis. Moving to more recent history, we encounter George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, Bush's decision to invade Afghanistan and target al-Qaeda had broad support. But in 2003, Bush made a far more controversial choice, invading Iraq. The Bush administration claimed Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and had connections to al-Qaeda. Neither claim was true. Intelligence was cherry-picked, exaggerated, or simply fabricated to justify a war the administration wanted. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented evidence to the United Nations that later proved unreliable. The invasion succeeded militarily within weeks. Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed. But the Bush administration had no coherent plan for what came next. They disbanded the Iraqi army, putting hundreds of thousands of armed men out of work. They dissolved Iraqi government institutions, creating a power vacuum. Sectarian violence exploded. What Bush's advisors promised would be a quick liberation turned into a decade-long occupation. Over 4,500 American troops died. Perhaps 200,000 Iraqi civilians died, though estimates vary widely. The war cost trillions of dollars. It destabilized the entire Middle East and helped create the conditions for ISIS to emerge. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The rationale for the war collapsed. Bush's decision to invade Iraq based on faulty intelligence without adequate planning for the aftermath ranks among the worst foreign policy disasters in American history. These decisions share common threads: presidential ego and stubbornness, refusing to admit mistakes or change course, surrounding themselves with yes men who reinforced bad ideas rather than challenging them, prioritizing political considerations over sound policy, ignoring expert advice that contradicted what they wanted to hear. Buchanan's weakness enabled the Civil War. Harding's cronyism corrupted government. Hoover's ideology blinded him to suffering. Kennedy's inexperience led to humiliation. Johnson's pride trapped America in an unwinnable war. Nixon's paranoia destroyed his presidency. Bush's certainty led to disaster in Iraq. The presidency attracts ambitious, confident people who believe they can solve problems others couldn't. That confidence becomes dangerous when it morphs into arrogance, when presidents stop listening, stop questioning their assumptions, and start believing their own mythology. The best presidents, Lincoln, FDR, and Eisenhower, were willing to admit mistakes, change course, and listen to dissenting views. The worst presidents doubled down on failure, blamed others, and let ego override judgment. American democracy has survived these disasters, but barely. Buchanan's failures led to a civil war. Nixon's crimes led to a constitutional crisis. Each disaster eroded public trust and damaged America's global standing. The consequences of bad presidential decisions aren't abstractions. They're measured in lives lost, opportunities squandered, and faith in democracy shaken. These historical failures offer lessons for today. Beware leaders who never admit mistakes. Question those who promise simple solutions to complex problems. Demand competence, not just loyalty. Hold leaders accountable when they fail. Because the presidency is too powerful and America too important to be led by people who refuse to learn from history's worst decisions. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of presidential failures valuable, subscribe for more history content. Next time, we'll examine moments when presidents got it right, decisions that save lives and strengthen democracy. Until then, remember, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it.